He didn't even look at me when I walked into the room I paid for, the chandeliers reflecting off polished marble floors I covered with my own money. And somehow I was still invisible. The man hosting my sister's wedding, her father-in-law, shook hands with everyone at the entrance, smiled wide, called them by name, then stepped right past me like I was part of the furniture. A woman beside him leaned in and whispered, "Who invited her?" Just loud enough for me to hear. Just quiet enough for everyone else to pretend they didn't. And the worst part wasn't the stranger who dismissed me. It was my own sister standing 10 feet away in a white dress I helped pay for, watching it happen. And saying nothing. If this story speaks to your heart, only if it truly resonates with you, take a moment to like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country, and what time it is for you right now, because I want to know how far this story travels tonight. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 33 years old, and this was the night my family finally realized who they had been overlooking all along. It started long before the wedding, long before the silence that would fall over that ballroom. Back when I was 19 and standing in a kitchen that smelled like burnt coffee and unpaid bills, holding my little sister's hand while she cried over a future she thought she'd lost, and I made a decision that would quietly rewrite both of our lives without anyone ever really noticing. I didn't come back for the celebration. Not really. I came back to watch something unfold, something I had already set in motion weeks earlier. Because, while they were arranging centerpieces and seating charts, I was arranging something else entirely. Something no one in that room was prepared for. But that night, standing near the entrance as guests brushed past me in tailored suits and polished heels, I let them believe exactly what they wanted to believe, that I was just the older sister who showed up alone. No ring, no title worth mentioning, no place at the table except whatever chair was left over. I watched as my sister laughed with her new family, as her father-in-law took control of the room like he owned every breath inside it, and when his eyes skimmed over me without recognition, without curiosity, without even the courtesy of a nod, I felt something settle into place inside me, not anger, not even hurt, just a quiet confirmation of everything I had already known. They had built an entire narrative about who I was, and they were so confident in it, so comfortable, that they never once stopped to question whether it was true, and that was fine. Because in less than 10 minutes, every assumption in that room was going to collapse under the weight of a single sentence, a single name, and I wasn't going to raise my voice or demand attention. I was simply going to stand up at the right moment and let the truth arrive on its own terms, the way it always does when people least expect it. Because the thing about being invisible for so long is that you learn exactly when to step forward, and when you do, people don't just notice you, they remember you. I was seated at a table near the back of the ballroom. The kind of table people only notice when they are trying not to make eye contact, tucked beside a towering floral arrangement that blocked half the view of the stage, and for a moment I just sat there, so being described, hands folded loosely in my lap, listening to the low hum of conversation ripple across the room as if I were outside of it instead of in the middle of it. A server passed by and paused, hesitating just long enough to glance at the empty place card in front of me before setting down a glass of water without saying a word, and I caught the small shift in her expression. The quick calculation people make when they cannot place you. When they decide you are not important enough to ask. Across the room, my sister stood glowing under soft lights, her hand resting on the arm of a man whose family had spent the entire evening establishing their place in the world without ever saying it directly, the kind of presence that fills a room before a single word is spoken, and, beside him, his father moved with practiced ease, greeting investors, executives, people whose names carried weight, people who recognized each other instantly, people who never had to ask who belonged. I watched as he leaned in close to one guest, lowering his voice just enough to create intimacy, then straightened and laughed, the sound sharp and controlled, and when his gaze swept the room again, it passed over me a second time, slower this time, more deliberate, as if confirming that I was exactly who he thought I was, someone without context, without relevance, someone who did not need to be acknowledged. At the next table, two women glanced in my direction, their conversation dipping just enough for one of them to murmur, "Is she from his side or hers?" And the other shrugged lightly, the answer clearly not worth finding. And I felt that familiar sensation, not quite discomfort, not quite anger, but something steadier. Something I had learned to carry years ago when being overlooked stopped being surprising and became expected. I reached for the glass of water, the condensation cool against my fingertips, and took a slow sip, letting the noise of the room settle into the background as I focused on the details that always told the real story, the way people positioned themselves, the subtle shifts in posture when someone important entered, the quiet recalibration of attention. Because rooms like this always had a center of gravity, and tonight it was not where anyone thought it was. My phone vibrated once against the table, a soft, controlled buzz, and I glanced down just long enough to read the message that appeared on the screen, a name followed by a simple confirmation: "We have arrived." And I turned the phone face down without responding, my expression unchanged, my posture still. Because timing was never about urgency, it was about precision. At the front of the room, the music softened, a signal more than an announcement, and conversations began to taper as guests shifted their attention toward the stage where a microphone stood waiting, polished and expectant, and I watched as my sister's father-in-law made his way forward, adjusting his cufflinks with a small, practiced motion before taking the microphone, his presence commanding immediate silence without needing to ask for it, the kind of silence built on reputation rather than respect. He smiled, pausing just long enough to let the room settle completely, and began to speak, his voice measured, confident, weaving a narrative about family, about legacy, about the future they were building together, each word carefully chosen to reinforce the image he wanted everyone to see, and as he spoke, he gestured occasionally toward my sister, toward his son, toward the life they were stepping into, and not once, not even by accident, did he acknowledge the person who had made that moment possible. I did not look away, I did not shift in my seat. I simply listened, letting every word land exactly where it was meant to, because in less than 10 minutes, the balance of that entire room was going to change, and the same voice that filled it so easily now would falter, not because I interrupted, not because I demanded it, but because something he had chosen to ignore was about to become impossible to overlook, and when that moment came, I would not need to raise my voice. I would not need to explain anything at all. I would only need to stand, say one sentence, and let the truth do what it always does when it is finally seen. I had heard speeches like his before, the kind that sound warm on the surface but carry a quiet hierarchy underneath. And as he spoke about family and opportunity, I found myself tracing the edges of each sentence, noticing who he included and who he did not, how he said my sister's name with pride, how he praised his son's future with certainty, and how the idea of contribution seemed to begin and end within his own circle, as if everything valuable had originated there. I did not react. Not when a few guests nodded along, not when someone at my table murmured agreement, not even when he laughed lightly and said, "We are fortunate to welcome people into our family who understand our standards," a line that drew a ripple of approval across the room. Subtle but unmistakable, because I understood exactly what that meant, and more importantly, what it excluded. I kept my hands still, resting lightly against the tablecloth, feeling the faint texture of the fabric beneath my fingertips, grounding myself in the present while something older stirred quietly beneath the surface. Something built years ago in places far removed from polished ballrooms and curated conversations. There had been nights when the only light in our apartment came from a single lamp I could not afford to replace, when I worked back-to-back shifts and still counted every dollar twice before deciding whether we could afford groceries for the week, when my sister sat at the kitchen table surrounded by textbooks and I pretended not to notice how tired she looked, because if she saw it in me, she might start to worry, and I had already decided that worry was not something she needed to carry. I remembered the weight of responsibility settling in long before I was ready for it, the quiet understanding that there was no one else coming to fix things, no one else stepping in to take over, just me, making decisions that would shape both of our lives without anyone ever acknowledging that they were mine to make. Back then, recognition was never part of the equation, survival was, and I learned early that the most important work often happens where no one is looking. The room came back into focus as his voice continued, steady and controlled, and I noticed my sister glance briefly in my direction before looking away again, her expression composed, practiced, the kind of composure that comes from choosing not to see something rather than not being able to. And I did not take it personally, not anymore, because I had already accepted that people tend to remember the version of you that is most convenient for them. My phone vibrated again, a second message, shorter this time. "We are inside." And I let it rest where it was, face down, silent, because the timing was aligning exactly as expected, each piece moving into place without the need for intervention. At the edge of the room, near the entrance, I caught a shift in attention, subtle at first, a few heads turning. A pause in conversation that did not quite reach the stage yet, but would soon. The kind of movement that signals the arrival of someone who changes the dynamic without needing to announce it. I did not turn to look immediately. I did not need to. Because I already knew who had walked in and why they were here, and more importantly, I knew what it would mean when their presence intersected with mine in a room that had already decided who I was. The speech was nearing its end, his tone lifting slightly as he moved toward a closing line about unity and shared vision, and I could feel the anticipation building, not in the room, not yet, but in the quiet space between what everyone believed and what was about to be revealed. I drew in a slow breath, steady and controlled, the kind of breath that comes before stepping into something irreversible, and for the first time that evening, I allowed my gaze to lift fully toward the stage, meeting the moment without hesitation, because I knew that in just a few seconds, everything that had been said, everything that had been implied, everything that had been quietly accepted as truth, was about to be challenged by something far simpler and far more undeniable. And when that shift happened, it would not come from force or confrontation, it would come from recognition, the kind that cannot be ignored once it arrives. The kind that makes people reconsider everything they thought they understood about you. The applause came first, polite and controlled, the kind that fills a room without leaving any real impression, and as his final words settled into the air, people lifted their glasses, some nodding, some already turning back to their conversations. Because to them, the moment had already passed, but at the edge of the room, something else was beginning to take shape, something quieter, more deliberate, and I saw it in the way a few guests near the entrance straightened almost unconsciously. In the way a conversation cut off mid-sentence without explanation. In the way attention shifted not toward the stage, but toward the doors. I turned my head just slightly this time, just enough to confirm what I already knew. And there they were. 3 figures stepping into the ballroom with a presence that did not ask for recognition but received it anyway, their posture precise, their expressions composed, the kind of composure that comes from years of discipline rather than performance. One of them scanned the room briefly, not with curiosity, but with purpose, as if searching for something specific, and when his gaze passed over the tables, it did not linger on the centerpieces or the carefully arranged seating. It moved with intention, narrowing slightly as he continued forward. The shift spread slowly at first, like a ripple that had not yet reached the center. A few more heads turning, a subtle change in tone as conversations lowered just enough to make space for something unspoken, and still, on the stage, the man who had just finished speaking remained unaware, stepping back with a satisfied expression, adjusting his jacket as if the evening were unfolding exactly as planned. I remained where I was, still seated, still composed, my hands resting lightly in front of me. Because this was the moment where most people would turn, would try to follow the movement, would look for confirmation of what was happening, but I did not need to. I had already seen enough. The man near the entrance took a few more steps into the room, his eyes scanning again, more focused now, and then he paused, just for a fraction of a second, as if something had aligned, as if the search had reached its conclusion. And I felt it before I saw it, that shift in direction, that subtle recalibration of attention that happens when a room begins to recognize that something important is about to occur. At my table, one of the women who had spoken earlier leaned slightly forward, following the line of sight. her expression changing from casual interest to something sharper, something more alert, and I could almost hear the unspoken question forming in her mind, the same question that would soon move through the entire room, not yet spoken, not yet understood, but already present. I lifted my glass again, taking another slow sip, letting the moment stretch just a little longer, because timing was everything, and there was no need to rush what was already unfolding exactly as it should. On the stage, my sister's father-in-law turned slightly, noticing the shift in attention at last, his eyes following the direction of the room's focus, and for the first time that evening, his expression faltered, just slightly, just enough to reveal that something had changed beyond his control. He stepped forward again, as if to regain the center, lifting the microphone with a small, practiced motion, ready to speak, ready to redirect the room back to where he believed it belonged. But the words did not come immediately, because even he could feel it now, that shift in gravity, that quiet but undeniable movement of attention away from him. And in that brief pause, that small fracture in his control, the man who had entered the room took another step forward, his gaze now fixed, no longer searching, no longer scanning, but directed with certainty. And for the first time that night, I allowed myself to move, just slightly, my shoulders straightening, my posture aligning with something deeper than the moment itself, because the space between what they believed and what was true had finally narrowed to a single point, and all that remained was to step into it. The room did not fall silent all at once. It unraveled in layers. First the conversations closest to the entrance, then the tables along the sides, and finally, the low hum that had filled the space all evening began to thin into something sharper, something more focused, as if the entire ballroom had started to listen for something it did not yet understand. The man who had just been speaking adjusted his grip on the microphone, his smile tightening as his eyes followed the shift. And for a moment, he hesitated, just long enough for the change to become visible to everyone watching, just long enough for control to slip slightly out of his hands. I set my glass down with a soft, deliberate motion, the faint sound against the table barely audible, but to me it marked the exact point where everything transitioned from observation to action. The man near the entrance continued forward, each step measured, unhurried, his presence cutting cleanly through the space between tables, and now people were turning fully in their chairs, no longer pretending this was just another arrival, no longer able to ignore the direction of his attention. He was not looking at the stage. He was not looking at my sister. He was not looking at the center of the room where importance had been carefully arranged all evening. He was looking directly toward the back, toward a table that had been overlooked from the moment the doors opened. I rose from my seat slowly, not abruptly, not in a way that demanded attention, but in a way that aligned with what was already happening, and as I stood, a few nearby conversations stopped completely, the people closest to me shifting slightly as if recalibrating their understanding of who I was in real time. On the stage, the microphone lowered a fraction, the man holding it no longer speaking, his attention now fully redirected, his expression no longer composed but searching, trying to understand the shift he could feel but not yet control. I did not look at him. I did not look at my sister. I did not look at anyone except the man approaching, because this moment had never belonged to the room. It belonged to the intersection of two realities that were finally about to meet. He stopped a few feet away, close enough now that the distance between us no longer felt like part of the crowd, and for a brief second, everything held, the room suspended in that narrow space between expectation and recognition. I let that moment linger, just long enough for every eye in the room to settle, just long enough for the silence to become complete. And then I spoke, not loudly, not with force, but with clarity that carried further than volume ever could. "Do you even know my name?" The words did not echo. They did not need to. They landed exactly where they were meant to, cutting cleanly through every assumption that had been made about me since I walked through the door. There was a pause, a fraction of a second where the room seemed to hold its breath, where even the man on the stage remained completely still, his expression fixed between confusion and something else he had not yet identified. And then the man in front of me straightened, his posture shifting instantly from movement to recognition, his voice clear, steady, and unmistakably formal as he spoke in a way that carried across the entire ballroom without effort. "Colonel Evelyn Carter, it is an honor to finally meet you. We have been expecting your arrival." The reaction was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but absolute, a complete and total collapse of the narrative that had been built around me all evening. I did not turn to look at the stage. I did not need to. Because I could feel it. The sudden stillness, the sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind me, the way attention locked into place with a clarity that had not existed before, and in that silence, the kind that does not ask for explanation because it already understands, everything shifted exactly as it was always going to. In the weeks that followed, the silence from that night did not linger the way people might expect. It did not turn into confrontation or apology or even explanation. It simply settled into something quieter, something more honest. My sister called me a few days later, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. Not defensive, not distant, just uncertain. As if she was speaking to me for the first time without the version of me she had carried for years. And we did not revisit the wedding, not directly. We talked about small things at first, about how she was adjusting, about the way life feels after everything changes, and somewhere in between those pauses, something began to rebuild. Not perfectly, not completely, but with a kind of clarity that had never existed between us before. Her new family never reached out, and I did not expect them to, because some lessons are not meant to be explained, they are meant to be understood in silence. The kind that stays with you long after the room has emptied. As for me, I returned to my work, to a life that had always been full even when no one acknowledged it, but something shifted inside me. Not in my confidence, not in my sense of identity. Those had been built long ago, but in what I was willing to tolerate, in the quiet boundaries, I no longer felt the need to justify, because I finally understood that being unseen is not the same as being unworthy. It just means you are standing in the wrong place, surrounded by the wrong expectations. And if you are listening to this and something in it feels familiar, if you have ever sat in a room where people decided who you were without asking, where your value was measured by what they could understand instead of what you carried, I want you to know this. You do not need to raise your voice to be recognized. You do not need to prove yourself to people who have already chosen not to see you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand still, hold your ground, and let the truth arrive when it is ready, because when it does not ask for permission. It simply changes everything. Thank you for staying with me through this story, and if you on tent 10. Truly, because stories like this are not just about what happened, they are about the quiet moments we all carry, the ones that shape us in ways no one else sees. And if this moment reached you in any way, I would love to hear where you are in your own journey, what silence you have learned to walk away from, and what truth you are still holding on to. And only if this story truly resonated with you, you can like and subscribe. But more importantly, just know you are not alone in this. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 33 years old, and the lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never let someone else's limited view define the full extent of who you are.